without further ado, I want to move forward to the Southeast Economic Advancement Project present white paper. This was kind of the central initial project program for our event today, for this phase 1 event. And so I'm going to turn it over to Jenny Castillo to kind of explain to you how this all came to be and move forward with the presentations.
Thanks so much, Ava, and thank you all so much for being here. My name is Jenny Castillo, and I am the Regional Engagement Director for the Southern Economic Advancement Project, also known as SEAP. We partner with policy thinkers and doers to amplify their effort and bridge gaps in policy infrastructure. We act as a connector, convener, and policy entrepreneur across issues and states, translating good ideas to the Southern context. Our goal is to advance policies that improve economic security, healthcare access, and environmental justice for all Southerners. I would like to give a special shout out to our Executive Director, Sarah Beth Gale, Dee Dee Dunham, our Communications Manager, and our new Data Director, Maria Filippelli, who are here today as well. SEAP was founded in 2019 by Stacey Abrams, and our first task was to travel the South to speak to organizations and individuals working in communities on issues of housing, childcare, employment, rural development, and justice. In some places, we heard again and again about the Appalachian Regional Commission and the benefits it has brought to communities. But when we traveled to other places like South Georgia, there was no such talk. Instead, we heard about a lack of a shared economic agenda, a lack of inclusion in development and growth, and a lack of infrastructure to move communities forward. We joined the Southeast Crescent Regional Commission Working Group in 2020 because we believe in the critical work by Ava and others over the past few decades to bring the Southeast Crescent Commission into being and begin the work of shared prosperity across the region. Our focus is on policy research and network building across the South. So we are excited to support these 5 scholars as they examine the opportunity for the Southeast Crescent Regional Commission as it starts operation in the coming months. With that, we will have a great presentation of our white paper that will be released hopefully at the end of the month, and we will be able to share that with you all. Today, we have the honor of welcoming Rick Donner, who is a Goodrich White Professor Emeritus in the Department of Political Science at Emory University, whose focus of research has been political economy of development with an emphasis on industrial and agricultural growth. His current semi-retirement teaching focus is in the politics of public health. He is also a founder and co-leader of the Atlanta chapter of the Scholars Strategy Network. Michael Rich is a professor of political science and environmental sciences at Emory University. His research and teaching interests focus on public policy analysis pertaining to workforce development, neighborhood revitalization, and local collaborative efforts to reduce poverty and promote economic mobility. Veronica Womack serves as the Executive Director of the Rural Studies Institute and Professor of Political Science and Public Administration at Georgia College and State University. Her focus on research is on the Black Belt region, rural communities, and socioeconomic disparities in agricultural policy. She is a dedicated interdisciplinary public scholar who was raised in the Alabama Black Belt region and currently works within the Georgia Black Belt region. Charles Hankla is an associate professor of political science at Georgia State University and co-leader of the Georgia Department chapter of Scholar Strategy Network. He is a specialist on the political economy of development and has worked with local governments in a number of countries. And Gloria Bromell Tinubu is an applied economist, agricultural economist, and community economic development consultant with over 40 years of experience, currently serving as the lead researcher at Tuskegee University for the State of African Americans in the Black Belt, a new yearly report of the Carver Integrative Sustainability Center, College of Agricultural, Environment, and Nutrition Sciences. Her areas of interest include applied research, community economic analysis, wealth building, poverty reduction, economic inclusion, heirs property, and sustainable development. We will be hearing from these incredible scholars and have opportunities for questions at the end. So we'd like to turn over the mic to our scholars, starting off with Charles Hankla.
Okay, thank you so much, Jenny. I'm going to share my screen and bring up the talk. Let's see here. Having a little, try this again. Okay. For some reason, I'm having a little trouble, but we will get this figured out.
Okay, hold on. Let's see.
I'm good. I think I've got it.
Okay.
I think it was my fault. All right, can you see?
Okay, yes, we can see it now.
All right, excellent. Okay, let me go into slideshow mode and everybody can hear me?
Yes.
All right.
We can hear you.
Excellent. All right, well, good morning, everyone. It's really an honor and a pleasure to be here. I'm Charles Hankla from Georgia State, and just to give you a little background, I want to thank Jenny for the introduction and the great background. Just to give you just a brief background of what we want to do today. Our team of 5 scholars and practitioners has been working for the last few months to put together a white paper for SEAP and for the Roosevelt Institute that uses data, research, and prior experience to make some specific recommendations for the structure and activities of the Southeast Crescent Regional Commission. This is not a closed project. Actually, we'll be putting together a final white paper in a few weeks that will reflect what we present today, but we also hope that you all will make comments in the chat box and also contact us. We'll have our contact information at the end of the talk with any comments and feedback and thought that we'd really love to incorporate, because we know that all of you have incredible expertise, and we hope that you will share your feedback and thoughts with us so that we can incorporate them into the final version. Okay, so the themes of today's white paper, the structure of what we're going to do today, we'll start with background and context, then we'll talk about the origins of the SCRC. We'll look at lessons from past experience, the Appalachian Regional Commission, especially in other efforts. We'll have a look at some assessments and indicators of need that could be used by the SCRC, using Georgia as a case study, and then we'll get into our specific recommendations. So it's always good to begin with a map. So in purple, you have the traditional southeastern US. In blue, you have counties that have normally been classified as part of the Black Belt. And then enclosed in the black line there, you have the SCRC's boundaries. So as all of you probably already know, the Black Belt and the SCRC have significant overlap, but are not entirely coterminous. There are parts of the Black Belt that are not in the SCRC. Some of them are under the other commissions, like the Delta Commission. And there are parts of the SCRC that have not traditionally been defined as part of the Black Belt, but there is enough overlap that we think we can consider them to some extent together. So let me turn this now over to Veronica Womack from the Rural Studies Institute at Georgia College and State University. Veronica.
Thank you, Charles. Thank you. Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Wonderful. I am so excited to speak with the group today. I never would have imagined 20 years ago, when I was riding around the Black Belt region with Ava in a car with a printer, that we would actually end up here. So I am really ecstatic. Today, I will talk to you a little bit about the background and context to the commission. So in 1938, President FDR gave a message about the South and its economic condition. He spoke specifically to the fact that the South was the nation's #1 economic problem, and that there was an imbalance, an economic imbalance in the nation. And part of that was the conditions of the South. Since then, the South has focused on several economic development strategies to transition itself from an agriculturally based economy to a 20th century industrial one, and now currently a 21st century economy that's focused on global efforts and knowledge-based economic decisions. through ingenuity, innovation, and several sustainable economic strategies, the South has focused on industry recruitment, the development of industry and small business. Some communities within the South are focused on their students and equip them through STEAM to be able to be successful in this economic development strategy of global economy. Other communities are taking advantage of this knowledge-based economy that's focused on technology. And so the South has become a destination for companies and startups. We recently learned that our home state of Georgia has been named 8 years in a row for the best state to do business. So the economic development strategies of the South have been very successful for some communities. Next slide. When we look at the Southern region, we see that it has managed to remake itself and to participate in many new economies, but not all of this development is equal. And that some of the most underdeveloped and under-resourced communities, most of them rural communities, continue to rely on public sector jobs and the few remaining low-skill, low-wage jobs as their primary means of support. Next slide. So we have here two maps. The first map speaks to the significance of regions. And so we see the Black Belt region, we see the Southeast Crescent region, Appalachia, the Southwest region. So we're seeing a history of regional place-based development in the first map. The second map focuses on persistent poverty counties. So rural communities within the Southern region are vulnerable and are underdeveloped, and many are persistent poverty counties. Recently, the USDA put out a report of 310 counties with high levels of persistent poverty. 267 of those counties are in the regions of the Mississippi Delta, the Appalachian region, and the Black Belt region. And what's really important about the Black Belt region is that while this underdevelopment impacts all people, it is particularly devastating to the generational impact of economic inequality that has been experienced by African-American residents. Half of rural Blacks live in persistent poverty counties within the South. While the SCRC has both rural and urban counties, some very affluent counties, but the region itself and the commission was designed around the underdeveloped communities. Next slide. So here, just for historical context, on the left side is an 1860 map of predominantly African-American communities. So the darker the county, the more African-American population. And on the right, the same map in 2020. So you see a very distinct regional manifestation of race here in this slide. Next slide. So let's talk a little bit about the uniqueness of the Black Belt region. The generational persistent poverty, the lack of generational wealth, particularly amongst African-American residents, less than 60 years of voting rights that African-Americans have within this region. I'm 52 years old. Entrenched hierarchical power structure that is part of the decision-making of those local communities. And then the stratified economic, social, and political life that continues in the rural South, as well as a growing diverse population. I was at a discussion yesterday that was hosted by the Georgia Chamber that said within the state of Georgia, 85% of new population growth within this state in rural communities will be diverse. So the SCRC and its implementation must be intentional and it must be measured with these issues in mind. Next slide. Finally, we often talk about the Black Belt region from a deficit model, and it's important to note the assets of this region. And for me, the assets are the residents who are resilient, they're innovative, they're determined, and to also acknowledge that traditional economic development entities could be expanded, that there's other stakeholders such as small business owners, farmers, cooperatives, community-based organizations, HBCUs, and faith-based organizations. They're also assets and should be included in decision-making. So intentional policy planning and implementation should include all of these assets into inclusive planning for the SCRC, and any successful economic development strategy for this region must realize the complexity of this region. Next slide. Next slide, Charles.
Sorry, it's strangely frozen. Yeah. Oh, okay.
All right.
Got it.
So just to recap thank you, Charles. To recap the specific challenges of the region, any economic development approach needs to consider the region's historical and socioeconomic exceptionality, its underdevelopment, the limited local capacity to implement policy, a racialized local, state, and regional politics that still occurs, persistent generational poverty, the large African-American population within, the racial and economic stratification, the growing diversity within the region, a very unique traditional political culture, the historical and present factors of de jure and de facto racial segregation, and the lack of trust that is often present amongst community groups. So these factors provide a context or a backdrop for traditional economic development approaches within the region, and we need to make sure that we recognize those as we move forward. Next slide.
Don't know why it keeps freezing. Okay.
Okay, so thank you. And now I will pass it off to Gloria, who will talk to us about the ARC and its development and the significance for the Southeast Crescent Regional Commission. Gloria?
It helps to unmute, right? Sorry about that. Thank you, Veronica, and good morning, everyone. As it has been indicated, the Southeast Crescent Regional Commission is modeled after ARC, and which was established in 1965 to address economic and social disparities between Appalachia, which is a majority white, poor rural population, and the rest of the nation. SRC, on the other hand, was created to address persistent poverty in the Black Belt region of the country where the majority of Black Americans live. And as Ava indicated, in 1990 at Tuskegee University's Professional Agricultural Workers Conference, Wimberly, Morris, and Bechtel presented a data-driven proposal for a commission that held, as they indicated by their data, more of the nation's poor rural people than even Appalachia. It was originally proposed as a Black Belt Commission. It was ultimately named and authorized as the Southeast Crescent Commission in 2008 Farm Bill to explicitly avoid addressing issues of race and institutional racism. Next slide, please. So the ARC of the past is somewhat different than the ARC of the present. In the 1960s, they focused on highway system, mining, sewer treatment, forest management, land stabilization, conservation, erosion control. Today, their focus is much broader, building businesses, workforce, ecosystems, community infrastructure, regional culture and tourism, leaders, and local capacity. Next slide, please. So the thing that I found interesting was that in 1965, when the ARC was created, I was able to find a copy of their original structure. And it kind of looks similar to what it is today in 2022. But I also found a 1975 structure that was a little bit different and very interesting. It included health and child development. It included education. It included community development. So that 1975 ARC was a lot different from the ARC that we see today. And it certainly is informative that it once had a more holistic structure at that time. Next slide, please. So today we know ARC has made tremendous investments, 161.8 million. This is from their 2020 fiscal year annual report, 474 projects, 858 million in additional private investment, 26,300 jobs either created or retained, and 20,800 students and workers trained and educated. And so they are to be applauded for the good work that they've done. Next slide. But one of the things that is important to realize is that while jobs and people, a number of people serve is one way of looking at success, this is some advice that came from NATO and the Economic Development Administration about how we should really measure success. And it's from their report called Performance Metrics Matter. And the quote says, and I'll read it in full, most regions tend to measure traditional metrics such as jobs, programmatic activity, businesses created, and clients served. Those measures may have sufficed in the 20th century, but the conditions that set the stage for job growth in the 21st century, knowledge-based economies are quite different. In order to attract and retain companies and workers today, regions must put more focus on performance metrics that measure quality of life, demographic mix, educational attainment, climate of innovation and entrepreneurship, arts and culture, recreation, healthcare, knowledge, and skill assets. These are the factors that current and future companies and talent increasingly care about. Next slide, please. So measuring progress. I believe that ARC recognized this. And so they made these statements in their 2020 report. They said, according to the US Census, the percentage of poverty for the nation is 14.1, but in the Appalachian region it's 15.8, so it's still well above. It's not in parity when it comes to poverty yet. The median income of Appalachian households was 49, close to 50,000, but in the US the average is 60. But the most telling thing is in terms of health. They talk about how the opioid crisis has impacted healthcare and indicated that opioid-related overdose mortality rate for people aged 15 to 64 was 57% higher in Appalachia than in the US. And also a report indicated that, I guess when people speak, it comes up over my screen. I don't know what's going on, but a report indicated that the 7 of the 10 leading causes of death in the US, heart disease, cancer, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, injury, stroke, diabetes, and suicide, that the Appalachian region had higher mortality rates than the nation for each of those. So, and they recognize that and they are looking to address those issues. Next slide, please. And this is a map that shows clearly what's happening in terms of mortality rates. This is also from their report. The redder or pinker the counties are, the worst off. So you can see in 1968, there was less red in 1968, but in 2010, which is what they showed for their last available data before the 2020 census came out, the region has gotten redder. So mortality rate has increased pretty severely. Next slide, please. And the other thing that that came across that I thought was interesting was that in 2003, ARC had 30 counties that were either competitive or designated as attainment. They had 21 competitive and 9 attainment in 2003 for a total of 30. Today, they only have 12 competitive and 4 that are in attainment for a total of 16, representing respectively a 43 and a 56% decline in competitive and attainment counties. While they've had some changes with respect to those other categories, slight changes, this is kind of disturbing that they're losing competitive and attainment counties. Next slide, please. So ARC understood this, so they had the Urban Institute to do an analysis of their performance measures. And these are the recommendations from the Urban Institute, that they should enhance the measurement, strengthen reporting, improve capacity through guidance and training, build shared understanding and improve communications, and lead on equity. Next slide, please. With respect to enhanced measurement, they indicate that they should institutionalize and consistently communicate a theory of change, connecting mission to measurement and evaluation across grant-making activities and funded projects. So a theory of change could be one like the one that WealthWorks used, which looks at capital of communities. Refine measures more holistically to capture grant outputs and outcomes, communicate differences between outputs and outcomes, and align processes, resources, and expectations. Clearly operationalize all measures to improve grantee selection process and the reliability of ARC reporting on aggregate outputs and outcomes. Next slide, please. And lead on equity. They said they should expand the definition of underserved populations and places in Appalachia and set goals for reaching them through grant-making activities and impact, improve marketing materials, diversify outreach to reach grantees serving underserved populations and places, target and prioritize projects that propose doing more to advance equity and actively mitigate the impact of bias on grant-making decisions, adopt measures to track equitable distribution of project awards, benefits, and improvements, educate stakeholders, staff, grantees, everyone on the value of and process for increasing equity in Appalachia through ARC grant-making, be a leader for other rural regions to follow. Next slide, please. So there's a stark difference between SCRC and ARC. As Ava said earlier, ARC is a bottom-up creation. It took 18 years to create and 13 years to activate. It was created during the height of the Great Recession. It deals with 21st century issues. Thus far, for fiscal year 2022, it's been appropriated $5 million, and it's activated in the age of racial equity. ARC, top-down creation, President Kennedy first recommended it, and President Johnson made it happen. Took only 2 years to create and activate, created during the height of the civil rights movement. 20th century issues, and as of fiscal year 2022, they've been appropriated $200 million plus a billion that will be awarded over 5 years, but they've been appropriated that amount for their coal communities. And again, we've seen some racial retrenchment. Next slide, please. So back in 2003, an organization called the Southern Food Systems Education Consortium, SOFSAC, along with a large group of community-based organizations, issued a report called Persistent Poverty in the South, a community-based perspective for a Black Belt Regional Commission. And this is what they said: designing a mechanism to fund priorities that will ensure that fair treatment on input from residents of the census tracts that have the greatest need is of utmost importance as we seek to eliminate systemic persistent poverty and better manage related racial issues. The problems related to poverty in this section of the South are race related and require a solution that takes racial issues into consideration. They were way ahead of their time in talking about issues of racial equity. Next slide. And just to mention, I think Dr. Hill is on the call, but Veronica as well as Ava participated in that report. SOPSEC priorities were education, healthcare, not just transportation, but public transportation systems, buses, light rail, housing, community economic development, infrastructure with a max of 25% on roads and bridges. Their priorities included the ones that are listed here: transportation, infrastructure, but no, I'm sorry, what was authorized in SCRC are the ones on the right: transportation infrastructure, basic public infrastructure, telecommunications, job skills training, skills development and employment related education, entrepreneurship, technology and business development, basic healthcare and other public services, conservation, tourism, recreation, and preservation of open space, renewable and alternative energy sources. Next slide, please. So these were the recommendations. They basically made recommendations in 3 areas. In terms of structure, strategies, and priorities. In terms of structure, they recommended that it should be broad, inclusive, and reflect the population being served. They proposed a constituency representative at the commission level, and that person would be a low-income person to represent the low-income population being served. And they also recommended a constituency representation board at the local level that would include those local development districts, or LDDs, community-based organizations, businesses, universities, governments, and citizens. And the strategies they proposed were the ones that have been found to be best practices for addressing persistent poverty: comprehensive community planning, education, community economic development, and resource development, particularly with a focus on capital. And the priorities were: resources should be equitably distributed using not just county level data, but census tract data to areas of greatest need as defined by the community development strategy planning priorities, and to grantees who directly interface with the persistent poverty population. Next slide, please. A recent report pretty much echoed exactly what SOPSEC recommended when they said few federal place-based programs have pursued comprehensive systems change. That is, efforts to identify the root causes of community problems and change policies, practices, and relationships, and thinking to address those causal forces. In fact, few programs have examined underlying issues such as structural racism, and the federal government has not provided local organizations or intermediaries with dedicated support that could drive transformative system change. Next slide, please. But that has changed. President Biden, on his first day in office, January 20th, 2020, in 2021, issued Executive Order 13985. And that executive order says, the title of it is Advancing Racial Equity and Support for Underserved Communities Through the Federal Government. And that's exactly what he's proposing to do, is to use the power of the whole of government to address these issues of racial and other inequities. Next slide, please. Part of what that executive order called for was a study to identify methods to assess equity, and a report produced 5 findings. And it said that there's a broad range of assessment frameworks out there for data measurement and measurement tools, but equity assessments still is a nascent and evolving science and practice. The second finding was administrative burden exacerbates equity. The third finding is that the federal government needs to expand opportunities for meaningful stakeholder engagement and adopt more accessible mechanisms for co-designing programs and services with underserved communities and customers. Finding 4 Advancing equity requires long-term change management and a dedicated strategy for sustainability. And finding 5, the scale of initiatives by the federal government creates an opportunity to advance equity by ensuring that resources are made available equitably through its core federal management functions, including financial management and procurement. Next slide, please. So one of the things that's happening is, and they started this before this executive order because it was through the White House initiatives for HBCUs, ARC has looked at its agency's goals and identified some goals that they will engage HBCUs. And those goals that they've identified are education and workforce development, economic opportunities, leadership, and community capacity. Next slide, please. And it's important that that's not only done by ARC, and they're leading the way and being an example, I hope, for the new commission, the Southeast Crescent. It's important because HBCUs have been determined to be engines of economic mobility. A recent study by McKinsey and Company pointed out this, and there were studies, academic studies prior to this one, and it says that the mean economic mobility for HBCUs is 3%. It's nearly twice that of all US colleges. So HBCUs are twice as able to move people, their students up the economic ladder than non-HBCUs. 10% of all Black students matriculate at HBCUs, 17% of all bachelor's degrees earned by Black students come from HBCUs, 24% of all STEM related bachelors. They supply more applicants to medical schools than non-HBCUs, graduated 40% of all Black engineers, 40% of all Black US Congress members, 50% of all Black lawyers, 80% of all Black judges. Hopefully one of them will be on the Supreme Court very soon. And they enroll more than twice as many Pell Grant eligible low-income students and help create upward mobility for those students. HBCU graduates are 51% more likely to move into a higher income quintile than non-HBCUs. And finally, Black students, and I found this to be really interesting, Black students who attended HBCUs were less likely to develop risk factors for chronic disease later in life than those who attended predominantly white institutions. Next slide, please. So I sort of did a summary table here of the funding that has been received from 1965 to 2022. And these are appropriated non-highway investments. So highway investment will blow these numbers up even more. So these are just the non-highway investment numbers. So of course, from 1965 to 1998, ARC was the only game in town, and over that period, they were authorized or appropriated $4.1 billion. So let me go back up to the yellow slide. So in terms of their authorizations, ARC has been authorized for $200 million annually. Denali, which is one state, that's Alaska, $15 million annually. The Delta Regional Authority, $30 billion annually. The other one, NGPRA, is no longer in existence. The Northern Border Regional Commission, as Ava said, started at 30 million, but it's revved up to 33 million. SBRC, the Southern Border Regional, the same thing. So the last three were authorized at the same time. And of course, SCRC is also now at 33 million. That's the funding that's been authorized. So for, as I said, from 1965 to 1998, it was just ARC. 1999 to 2021, there was 2.1 billion in non-highway investment for ARC, 573, almost 574 million for Denali, 329 for Delta, skip that one, 124 million for the Northern Border, 250,000 for the Southern Border Regional Commission. And as of 2021, there was 3.75 that had been awarded to SCRC. And for 2022, these are the numbers, the 1.2 billion, and again, that 1 billion is over 5 years. but it's been appropriated 75 billion for Denali, 150 billion for Delta, 150 million, I'm sorry, for Delta, 150 million for northern border, 1.2 million for the southern border, and 5 million for SCRC. And those are the totals. Next slide, please. This is the last slide. The major takeaways with respect to the Southeast Crescent Regional Commission are that race and racism matter, equity matters, structure matters, strategies matter, priorities matter, authorizations and appropriations matter, performance measurements matter. That's the end of my remarks. Now I would like to turn it over to Michael Rich.
Hi there, everyone. There we go. Get my camera started. All right, so I'm going to, in this section of the presentation, I'm going to be talking about definitions of need. We're going to get a little bit into the categorization and measurement. I saw a couple of questions in the chat about how these different categories are defined. We'll be covering that. I'll also be talking about capacity building and providing some recommendations regarding funding. Targeting aid to distressed communities has been a feature of federal programs going back to the War on Poverty, and really came into prominence during the Carter administration in the 1970s, receded in the 80s, and then reemerged in the early 1990s with the rise of comprehensive community initiatives, largely spawned by national and local foundations, and then later picked up by the federal government through initiatives such as empowerment zones, promise zones, and perhaps most notably, the Obama administration's neighborhood revitalization initiative. The ARC and other federal regional commissions are required by law to award at least 50% of their grants to distressed communities. In addition, distressed communities will have lower matching rates, which means that the federal government will pay a larger share of the project cost. The SCRC is required by law to designate distressed counties and areas at least annually, and its designations are a collapsed version of the categories that are used by the ARC. The law calls for the SCRC to identify distressed communities, transitional communities, and attainment communities, and to also provide provisions for designating isolating areas of distress. These are communities that are in otherwise relatively well-off counties that would meet the requirements at a lower level of geography, such as a census tract or a zip code for distressed communities. Next slide, please. So there are a variety of ways we could measure need and incorporate need criteria in the design of federal aid programs. The ARC defines need based on a county's economic status and uses 3 indicators to determine that: the 3-year average unemployment rate, the per capita income, and the poverty rate. There are other indexes that are out there that have been published in the past few years, and we're using one of these in our presentation, the Distressed Communities Index, which was developed by the Economic Innovation Group to illustrate the implications of how one defines need. In our view, the Distressed Communities Index is a broader measure of distress. It includes variations of the ARC's 3 indicators, plus 4 additional measures: the percent of adults without a high school diploma, the housing vacancy rate, and 2 measures of change: the change in employment between 2015 and 2019, and the change in business establishments between 2015 and 2019. Thus, in addition to having a broader set of measures, the Distressed Communities Index also includes indicators of the level of distress, as well as indicators that capture economic trends over time. Next slide, please. For comparison purposes, we rescaled the Distressed Communities Index to be identical to the scaling and classification used by the ARC. And those are noted on the slide that you're viewing now. For example, distressed communities are defined as the 10% of counties nationally with the highest need based on the indexes. At-risk counties are defined as those counties that rank between the 10th and 25th percentile based on need. Attainment counties at the other end of the scale are the 10% of counties nationally that are the most vibrant. Next slide. If we look at the distribution of counties by these two measures of need, we find that overall they're moderately correlated. Those 640 counties are considered worse off on the Distressed Communities Index as compared to the ARC's county economic status, and 687 counties are considered better off on the Distressed Communities Index than the ARC measure. And we show the distribution and how they cross-tabulate on this slide. Next slide, please. So here we show the spatial distribution of the needs in the SCRC counties based on these two measures of need. The left map shows the county economic status used by the ARC, and the map on the right shows what the distribution would look like with the same scaling and the same time periods before the Distressed Communities Index. The darkest red shaded counties represent counties that have been classified as distressed, and the pink shaded counties are those that are in the at-risk category. Next slide, please. So here we zoom in a little tighter at Georgia, where we can look more closely at the differences in classification between the two indexes and point out some of those differences. The green arrow points out that Warren County is considered distressed on the ARC measure, but is transitional, which is the middle and modal category on the Distressed Communities Index, which is an improvement of 2 groupings on the distress scale. The red arrows point out several counties in southern Georgia that are worse off on the Distressed Communities Index, indicating they have higher needs than that captured by the ARC measure. All of these counties move from the at-risk category to the distress category, a change of 1 grouping on the scale. Next slide. For isolated areas of distress, we illustrate a strategy for identifying these areas. The map on the left shows the distribution of need based on the Distressed Communities Index at the county level, and the map on the right shows the distribution of need at the zip code level based on the same index. We highlight some of the isolated areas of distress that emerge from this analysis. They include, for example, areas in Fulton and DeKalb County, which are both categorized as competitive at the county level, but looking at the map on the right-hand side, show several zip codes that would be classified as distressed if we looked at data at the zip code level. There are several other examples that are highlighted that show counties in the competitive and transitional groupings that have at the county level that have zip code areas in the distress category, and the red arrows kind of link those from the county level to the zip code level. Next slide, please. We now move to a consideration of a county's assets for community and economic development, and begin by looking at the presence of foundations and philanthropic organizations, which, as one of our morning speakers, Earl Gohl, the former ARC co-chair, noted were instrumental in moving the ARC's work forward. This slide shows the distribution of philanthropic organizations in Georgia and the amount of grant awards they have made in support of community and economic development over the past 5 years. The shaded areas show the total amount of grants awarded by philanthropic organizations located in those zip codes. The white zip codes have no philanthropies that made grants in support of community and economic development. The color shaded areas step from dark red, grants totaling less than $10,000 over the 5-year reference period, to dark green, which represent grants awards of $1 million or more by charities located in that zip code. The circles show the zip code location of grant-making charities and are color-coded by the type to highlight the presence of community foundations, which are denoted by the blue circle, family foundations, green circles, and United Ways by red circles. These are philanthropies that are much more likely to be partners in community and economic development. To avoid clutter, we are only displaying grant-making organizations that made at least $50,000 in grants for community and economic development over the past 5 years. Next slide, please. Okay, catch up. So another take on capacity is to look at the sources of community capital. In a recent report, the Urban Institute classified all rural census tracts in the US based on the types of community capital that were prominent. They examined 7 categories of community capital, which are listed on the slide. These include the built environment, cultural, financial, human, natural, political, and social. The census tracts were then grouped into 7 types or classifications based on the configurations of community capital present in each rural census tract. Next slide, please. In this slide, we show the typology clusters for counties in the SCRC region. Most rural counties in the SCRC tend to be one of 2 types: diverse institution-rich hubs, denoted by pink and shading, and the remote energy-rich hubs, which are shaded dark blue. Diverse institution-rich hubs are racially and ethnically diverse, have strong access to community institutions, and the greatest amount of community development investment. Note, however, the challenges faced by these tracts, and that's highlighted in the shaded box in the lower right panel of the slide. These are tracts that have, though they may be extremely diverse, have limited financial resources, low labor force participation rates, lowest life expectancy, and a variety of other needs that are pretty prominent. Next slide, please. In this slide, we map the total amount of all federal investments. This includes investments across all federal departments, agencies, and programs during fiscal years 2018 and 2019. And notice here that the vast majority of rural tracts in the SCRC region are shaded dark red, indicating that they had the lowest federal investment per capita of the classification scale used. Next slide, please. Next slide. All right. Back one. There we go. Thank you, Charles. In this slide, we build off our earlier mapping of Georgia philanthropic organizations by adding a layer to show the spatial distribution of community-based development and economic development organizations with at least $50,000 in annual revenues. These organizations are key assets for executing the projects, programs, and activities required to revitalize communities. These organizations are denoted by the pink stars on the map, and again, to avoid clutter, we omit the community development organizations located in the Atlanta metro area. Next slide, please. On this slide, we combine need and capacity and suggest that the SCRC in their decision-making make their allocations of resources based on considering not just need in isolation, but looking at need and its relationship to local capacity. Comparing the distribution of need and the distribution of capacity, here we've zoomed in on Georgia again, some important insights emerge. Some subregions of Georgia could be characterized as high need and high capacity, and those are denoted by the green outline in the map on the left. These areas may be ripe for immediate investments and show some evidence of having the capacity to act, as seen on the map on the right. Other subregions of the state, highlighted by the red outline, have high need but low capacity. While the needs in these communities may be comparable, they tend to lack the types of organizations that can assist in community outreach, strategic planning, and collaborative revitalization strategies, and will therefore require investments to help build that capacity. Next slide, please. To do so, we encourage the SCRC to build on the notion of combining the assessment of need and capacity by providing a portfolio of funding opportunities that will help communities scale up their efforts to address their most pressing needs. This portfolio of grant assistance could include the following: planning grants, which would be short-term grants to support a comprehensive community-based strategic planning process; capacity building grants, which would be medium-term grants to help the planning participants build the capacity of local agencies and organizations needed to carry out the tasks of revitalization; and implementation grants would be longer-term grants, perhaps as long as 5 or 10 years, to support the implementation of the community's comprehensive revitalization strategy. Examples of each of these types of grants are noted in the slide and were part of the Obama administration's Neighborhood Revitalization Initiative. Next slide. This slide shows the Building Neighborhood Capacity Program that was part of the Obama administration's Neighborhood Revitalization Initiative, and illustrates the 9 types of capacities for which the program provided assistance to communities to help them carry out a more integrated and participatory approach to comprehensive community and economic development. Next slide. This slide emphasizes that the federal regional commissions vary in their underlying conditions and the composition of the populations in their distressed communities. While the SCRC can and should certainly learn from the work of other regional commissions, we encourage SCRC stakeholders not to approach the launch of the SCRC in a cookie-cutter fashion. For example, while the share of counties in the SCRC that are distressed and at risk is comparable to the ARC, as shown in the top row of pie charts, the racial and ethnic composition of distressed communities in the SCRC is dramatically different. Here you can see that in the bottom row of pie charts. 9 out of 10 residents in ARC's distressed counties are white, compared to the SCRC, where half of the residents in its distressed counties are people of color, including 40% who are African American. This finding underscores the importance of the history, context, and experiences Veronica and Gloria spoke about earlier in our presentation, and emphasizes the need for the SCRC to move forward with a focus on equity and community-based participatory revitalization strategies. Next slide. To sum up this section, there are 3 key takeaways. First, it's not hard to define need, but the definition of need should closely align with the goals and objectives of the SCRC. And doing that will require finding data, indicators, and indices that are available nationally, credible, and updated regularly. Second is the importance of sequenced funding. Grant awards should be sequenced, planning, capacity building, and implementation, to ensure that all distressed communities receive assistance commensurate with their capacity to act. And finally, capacity building. There are multiple dimensions of capacity required to move a community forward, and many of those are highlighted on the Building Neighborhood Capacity Program slide. Many distressed communities will require assistance in building and strengthening their capacity to act in order to receive an equitable share of the resources provided and leveraged by the SCRC. Now I'm going to pass the baton to my colleague, Rick Donor, who will share with you our insights and recommendations about SCRC governance.
Thank you, Michael. My goal is to talk about the governance structure of the possible governance structure of the SCRC. And certainly we have learned and are learning a lot from the ARC experience. To wit, several comments or assumptions. First of all, we presume that this new federal commission will interact, engage at a number of levels or tiers. One is at the commission level itself. Another is at the state, sub-state, region, especially through the local development districts or LDDs, which obviously are the key link to communities. Our assumption is that the SCRC should encourage the flow of information both up from communities and down to communities through these tiers. Next slide, please. And I'm sorry, there's a little bit of a gap. We are concerned that the SCRC needs to balance the voices of elected officials and professional planners with those of community stakeholders. And also, we are assuming that the new commission will need to navigate levels of fragmentation. And what we want to encourage is that the representative arrangements within communities foster collaboration and inclusivity of race and ethnicity in situations where communities have been relatively fragmented. In addition, we want to encourage cooperation across the fragmented federal and state agencies that are concerned with local development. Next slide, please. So the key thing here, if there's any takeaway for us, it is the importance of aligning the governance structure of the commission with its shifting development priorities. And here we simply compare the emphasis of the SSRC to the development concept that have dominated in the ARC, as has been discussed already by Gloria. So next slide, please. Sorry, I'm not seeing this. So we have several proposals in order to develop with regard to a governance structure that is consistent with the focus on a strategy for inclusive development. At the commission level, the proposal is to broaden representation on the board itself to include community voices. And here, as the schematic shows, the proposal is to appoint something akin to an equity officer who would monitor and provide input to the top level board with regard to the performance with regard to issues of equity. There are some considerations that have to be dealt with and acknowledged. Increased representation is sometimes in tension with efficiency and flexibility. There are questions of legally mandated membership constraints. How would an equity officer fit in with those? And also, what would be the role and the power of such an equity officer with regard to voting rights, et cetera? Next slide, please. We also have some thoughts about the SCRC staff. Under the ARC, the staff, it's based on what we know, is really a key gatekeeper. They review proposals, they manage investments, they conduct research. Our suggestion is, as is seen in the lower right-hand side of this, the accompanying schematic, is to add a division to the existing ones under ARC to focus on community capacity and equity. We also hope that the commission staff is clear and transparent about the criteria with which proposals are reviewed in order to ensure congruence with shifting development priorities, that is community capacity, racial equity. We would hope that the staff functions are specified to include active solicitation and guidance of the LDDs and community input, and that the incentives and performance evaluation criteria of the staff are consistent with the functions that we have identified and proposed. Next slide, please. At the state level, the key or a key actor is the state program manager. And under the ARC model, as we understand it, the state program manager guides investments and policy decision and is really the key intermediary between the local development districts and the ARC staff. Here we have just some questions to ponder. Our impression is that program managers often wear multiple hats. That is, they may be a program manager and an employee or staff of the Department of Community Affairs or Economic Development Administration. We can see where this really does facilitate coordination across agencies, but we wonder whether there are disadvantages that stem from potentially different priorities across these agencies. In light of the those possible problems, we suggest the utility of a broader state level guidance body along the line perhaps of something similar that occurs in the Workforce Development Board. Next slide, please. At the quote lowest, but potentially the most important level, the local development districts. And just in terms of nomenclature, you will notice the asterisk below that the term local development districts or LDD are the same as economic development districts or EDD as designated by the Federal Economic Development Authority. They are called different things in different states. In Georgia, they are called regional planning commissions. These are supposed to be the lead organizations. But one of the challenges is that there is significant variation in capacity across these local development districts. There may be potential confusion with regard to how agencies and communities apply for funds. The LDDs can make applications either directly to the ARC staff or to the state. Similarly, the municipalities or counties within an LDD can apply directly to the state or to the LDD itself. In addition, community development system in which the LDDs operate are fiendishly complex. The LDDs comprise multiple counties. That's a good thing in many ways because it encourages cross-county collaboration, but there are potential jurisdictional conflicts. In addition, some LDDs or economic development districts, depending on what they're called, include counties which themselves are covered by different federal regional commissions. In addition, the LDDs are not coterminous with other relevant programs such as workforce development districts. And in some cases, the economic development districts established by the Economic Development Authority are not quite the same as the LDDs. They may have broader scope of focus. Lastly, we are concerned about the representation on the LDD boards. What seems to occur is a domination by local elected or appointed officials. There is some private sector certainly presence. This seems to be dominated by business and finance. It's not clear where agriculture comes in. And the representation on the boards by community-based organizations seems a bit minimal. Next slide, please. So as an example of the complexity, thanks to Gloria, we have identified one development commission, number 5, the South Central Alabama Development Commission, which is essentially the same as an LDD. And what we want you to note is that this, on the right hand, as one can see on the right hand slide, this South Central Commission, this LDD comprises or includes 6 counties, each one of which has somewhat different or varying commissions under which it operates. So Pike and Crenshaw County are slated to operate under SERC, Bullock under the Delta Regional Authority, Butler ARC, Macon ARC and DRA, and Lowndes and Macon County only under ARC. That can get somewhat confusing. There are also several counties in the local development district are served by 2 different workforce boards, as one can see in the blue outlined areas in this slide. Next, please. Here is just a slide developed by our colleague Michael Rich to show the complexity of the whole system in which the LDDs or regional planning agencies at the second to the bottom row are shown. They may be influenced by community affairs, economic development, etc. They themselves function, include multiple communities with different jurisdictions, etc. Next slide, please. And here is an illustration, or rather data, that informs our concern about board representation. And this is data that was gathered by one of Mike Rich's students. And what it shows here, at least for Georgia, is that in percentage, if you look at the bottom row, that almost 2/3 of the seats are filled by county, city, or other local government officials. The private sector is around a quarter, but the private sector is focused on business, banking, with faith-based organizations, healthcare, nonprofits, and those with multi-sector experience, relatively with low levels of representation. Next, please. So our proposal for the LDDs is to expand and specify the functions of inclusive strategic planning, to broaden the representation to include those who at this point are not well represented, CBOs, small businesses, including farms, sources of local expertise, ag extension folks, HBCU faculties, specifying voting rights of these people, and potentially add a local constituency board to ensure coordination. We also would hope to either establish or strengthening linkages among LDDs in order to foster information sharing, best practices, peer learning, and also to strengthen the LDD voices vis-a-vis program managers and commission staff. Next, please. I apologize if for some reason this is not showing up. Here we go. So, takeaways. Our focus in this presentation is really on the initial organization, structure, goals, etc. of the SCRC. To do that, our goal is right off the top to identify this combination of needs and capacities, as well as to learn from and adapt from the really valuable experience of other commissions, especially the ARC. We proceed on the basis of a broader concept of development that includes, certainly, but goes beyond infrastructure and investment. Obviously, a greater emphasis on race with regard to data, as well as goals. And as emphasized, we want to align governance with goals. And that means fostering broader representation of community stakeholders, incorporate sources of local knowledge, navigate the balance between more folks at the table and ensuring flexibility and efficiency. And finally, attempting or navigating the fragmentation of the community development system in which the SCRC will operate. Next slide. Anyway, that is, I don't see the next slide showing up, but it will. But that is it for my presentation. And we very much look forward to contact with all of you. And we encourage you to send us feedback with regard to parts of the presentation you found most valuable. What was not clear that you would have liked to clarify? Where were our gaps? What kind of information do you have to help us address those gaps? And so we all thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much to all of our amazing scholars and the incredible information that you all picked up. We'll leave this slide on for a little bit so y'all are able to take down the information and contact any of our presenters after today's conversation. We also have a couple of poll questions that we want to get your feedback on. So, Dealey, if you could launch the poll, we'd love to have you all answer some of these as we wait for some questions from our audience members so we can do some Q&A. But our first choices here, you can just fill everything out in one go. But where are you from? We want to know a little bit more about you. And are you in the District of Columbia? Is your office located within a community of less than 50,000 people? What is your sector or industry? If you are a grant-making agency, have you funded a individual community organization within the Southern region with less than 50,000 people within the last 5 years? At what geographic level is your work focused on? What aspects of community and economic development is your work most focused on? And do you include local community-based organizations that are not national organizations with local offices as partners in your strategic planning efforts? And the last question, does your organization have an education and outreach effort that is specifically target minority or underrepresented communities? So just take a moment to fill that out. I know it's more questions than you've probably had on a poll in the past, but we want to get to know a little bit more about who you are. We've seen some things in the chat, and we've also heard from some incredible speakers as of yet. So we'll just let that go for a little bit. If you're not seeing it, it should just pop up right on your screen, y'all. I know there have been a couple of technical difficulties, but as folks are answering those questions, we do have a couple of questions that come in from the audience. And so I'm going to make sure to pose this, and any of our amazing speakers can address it. Whoever feels most inspired by the question, feel free to answer it. But we got a question here saying ARC worsened for poor people after spending 500 companies and the wealthy, but not those most in need. Will this happen in the SCRC? How do we ensure a different result occurs? Gloria, would you like to respond?
Yes. I think the best way to ensure is to continue the grassroots efforts that have been started with the various colleges and community-based organizations to communicate exactly that sentiment, that this has to produce the desired results. And we know more now than we did 50 some, nearly 60 years ago. And we have to apply that knowledge, right? The knowledge that we need a more fair way of representing the issues and interests of the people that are being served, and that their voice should be at the table, and they should have some real say, not just an advisory capacity, but a real voice and vote in what happens. So I think that that needs to happen. And if it's not going to happen, then we need to maybe revisit the whole idea of this commission. I mean, it's that serious, because things have gone on so long that we can't continue to play with this. People's lives are impacted. Raw sewage is running in various parts of the Black Belt right now, and it needs to be addressed. So we keep working and we keep demanding for the right kind of model that makes sense for today's challenges.
Can I raise something in there to complement Gloria's?
Yes, please.
Well, I think, you know, what Gloria's speaking to is what's the nature of the governance structure, and what are the actual arrangements for representation and encouragement for engagement in the commission's activities. And here I think it would be especially useful to know what kind of challenges the ARC has met in attempting to engender this kind of representation? What can we learn from the ARC on these areas? Is it a question of not enough effort? Is it a question of community fragmentation? What are the experiences of others on that question?
And just to add one other point, the representation absolutely is critical. We all agree strongly on that, as Gloria and Rick said. Another potential mechanism is to have strict rules about which communities can receive the funding and what % of the funding needs to go to distressed communities. You know, a tricky element of the SCRC is that it covers a number of quite well-off communities, including Metro Atlanta. And so it's going to be important to ensure that the money doesn't all flow to communities that are already relatively well off. And even within poor communities, they're relatively well off areas. So, you know, it's also a question of what sorts of rules exist for ensuring that the money flows and the resources flow to areas that may not be in a position to most effectively demand and make requests for themselves. So certain kind of, in addition to the structural elements of representation, rules around resource allocation, we think can be helpful, and we're interested in feedback on exactly what those might be.
Can I add 2 more points that I failed to raise? One is the authorized amount of money for the Southeast Crescent Regional Commission is dismal. It is unacceptable. It's just a pittance compared to what is needed and what has been appropriated for other regions. The second thing is, it is the only region that was authorized and didn't designate the counties to be served, the specific distressed counties. Every other region had their distressed counties identified in the legislation. For Southeast Crescent Regional Commission, they just threw every county that wasn't a part of either ARC or the Delta region and said, well, those will be in the Southeast Crescent region. No attention to detail. It was like, go for it. And we're going to give you a few dollars on top of that. So the appropriation amount is just not acceptable. It's not enough. It's not close to being enough, as the table that I showed you suggests. And the way that it was done was totally outside of the way that the others were designated, with specific counties that were persistently poor counties identified in the legislation.
Thank you so much.
And I'll just add to Gloria's point, on the one hand, that's not good, but on the other hand, it presents a tremendous opportunity for the SCRC to be clear about what kind of need it wants to address and how it's going to go about measuring that need and connecting those indicators to the distressed communities that it identifies to focus on. Times are very different now from when the ARC was launched, when we had very limited data at the local level and had far fewer indicators to choose from on a regular basis in order to monitor how needs change. Today, we have a very rich portfolio of indicators that could be tapped to capture needs. So we have more opportunity to craft a measure of need to identify distress than was the case for earlier commissions. And the SCRC should capitalize on that by being clear about what types of need does it want to target and what will be the best indicators and the way to combine those indicators to measure distress.
Thank you all so much. We have about 5 minutes left in our section, and we have the results of the poll, so we can share those. As you see, a lot of folks coming in from Georgia. We appreciate you. And great representation from Alabama, Florida, Mississippi, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Virginia. And we'll be able to get all this information at the end of the programming, so you all can keep this as well. But good amount of folks that have 50,000 people or less than, and a lot of folks coming from government, so either federal government, state government, sub-state, regional government. and nonprofit organizations. And a lot of folks doing work across the board from what you all were asking from. And community development, economic development are some of the most focused efforts. And a lot of folks do include local community base in their work, and organizations have had outreach specifically to minority communities. So thank you all so much for filling those polls. We'll make sure that those get to our scholars as well as they continue to take this information in. To our scholars, there's a lot of work that's happening in this area, and a lot of the folks on the call live or work in the region. Do you have any recommendations for them? What could be their role and their part in ensuring that this commission does what it needs to do?
I think it'll be very important for people on this call to connect with their LDDs in their community, and to make sure that decision making that's being made or plans that are being made will be made in a very inclusive way. I think we need people on the call to also educate folk about the commission, that it's actually happening, the possibilities of the commission. And I think if we join together in a concerted effort and get the communication out there and support inclusive planning and decision making, that we'll be well on our way.
I'd like to just also add that because this is a federal commission, which will be reporting annually to the president and to Congress, I think it's important for you to let your members of Congress know what you think about this new commission, as well as the president. So let your voices be heard at the levels that will be making the allocations and authorizations. So make sure you communicate with your members of Congress as well as the president.
Thank you so much. Anybody else would like to add anything? All right, everyone, everybody on the call, we appreciate you, value your work. To Ava for putting this whole group together, we thank you for the attention and the importance of this. Some top notes. There has been a couple of questions. Will we get the presentation? Yes, you surely will. You have signed up and will receive an email from us afterwards, so you'll make sure to get that. But if you have any colleagues that you're like, wow, SEAP is doing such incredible work, we want to make sure that they're getting all the information, and particularly the news when our white paper is released. We encourage you to go to our website and sign up to our listserv. You can visit theseap.org and you can sign up there. We are excited about the next steps for this white paper and hope that all of you here today will take a moment to provide feedback as our authors continue to draft it. On the screen, you see their names and their emails. Special, incredible thank you to Rick, to Michael, to Gloria, to Veronica, to Charles. Y'all are incredible. Your presentation was fantastic, and we are so honored that you all were able to work with us to put this presentation out today. We will provide in the chat a Google form for your reaction and input. Y'all, we really want to hear from you. I think one of the most important parts of the work that we do is making sure that we're listening and actually having dialogue with the folks that are in this region, so that we know exactly what we can do to make sure that we are uplifting the needs and providing the most up-to-date information as possible. So thank you all so much. As you see on the contact information and questions part, we do want to hear from you. So what parts of the presentation did you find most valuable? What parts of the presentation did you find less clear? And where do you see gaps in the presentation? And any other information you want to address, please make sure to email us at these addresses. And you can also visit our website, once again, at theseap.org. Thank you all so much for your attention, your dedication, and the work that's happening. So I'm going to turn it back over to Ava. Thank you all so much.